In fact, the work that I'm going to be presenting for you this morning is based on that paper in Antiquity, and the reference is somewhere in here. So if you find it interesting, you can dig further through that. Yes, this morning's talk, I'm going to be talking about a series of pilot studies that we've recently completed with a range of colleagues looking at agricultural terraces in the Mediterranean. And this is the structure of my talk. I'm going to outline the problem and a potential solution that we have devised, tell you about the pilot studies, and then summarize the results so far from the overall project before outlining the future challenges we see and our research plan. I should thank, before I start, the people who have collaborated on this project. And there are a large number of colleagues and collaborators in different case studies. And especially I should mention Tim Kinnaird, whose lab in St Andrews processes the samples that we analyse. And of course also Jim Crow, who was just talking, who we collaborate with various places, but including Naxos, which I shall come back to later. Okay, so the problem was one that first occurred to me, at least, when I began a collaboration with Jim some 15 years ago, Jim, which is a terrifying prospect, on the island of Naxos. And the problem was this: we were interested in the historic landscape of Naxos, which is very rich and varied, and characterized especially by terraces, agricultural terraces. And these terraces bore many signs of antiquity. For example, in this area, part of the Drimalia plain of central Naxos, there are very many, very substantial historic oak trees growing on terraces, suggesting that they are of some antiquity, both the trees and the terraces. But there are also archaeological features and monuments like this church. This is the church of Aios Isidoros, and it appears to stand on one of these terraces. But we couldn't find any evidence to tell us independently how old these terraces were. We could see quite clearly that they were extremely widespread. So they are the green lines on the diagram you're looking at. The red lines represent dry stone walls. And in aerial photography and other sources, we could see that Naxos, just one island in the central part of the South Aegean, has thousands of kilometers of terraces constructed. You can see them in this beautiful air photograph taken by the RAF in 1943. So we attempted to devise some initial approach to understanding this problem. And we originally used the simple technique of retrogressive analysis in the GIS, where we mapped the terraces and we mapped related features. And from this, we could see clearly that the terraces belong to an earlier stage of landscape organization. Here in the diagram, you can clearly see the red of the dry stone walls overlying the green of the terraces in many, many places. And this is a completely typical situation on Naxos and many other areas. In fact, we have this stratigraphy in the landscape where the terraces are older than the dry stone walls, which in this case are thought to be 18th or 19th century. But this is only a relative chronology, and it doesn't give us absolute dates on the age of these terraces. So the key question remained: how old are such terraced features? There are various types of evidence and have been various approaches to addressing this question. Unfortunately, the documentary evidence for the use of terraces and terrace fields, I mean, it does exist, but it's relatively slight. So in some of the better documented parts of early medieval Europe, such as Catalonia, we do have references to the existence of terraces at this place, Sant Julià de Cerdanyola in Catalonia. There's a 9th or 10th century reference in Carolingian documents to facies, the local name for the terraces. And you can see them extending up the valley here, and indeed onto the valley sides around the settlement. But of course, the problem with the documentary sources is that the interpretation of the term facies is not completely certain. And also, even if terraces existed there, we don't know that they were these terraces that we can see in the landscape today. And so we still don't know how old these are or what the character of the terrace systems might have been like in the early medieval period. There have been various scientific approaches to dating terraces using laboratory methods and archaeological techniques. So, for example, sometimes archaeologists are confident about dating features like terraces from the inclusion of material culture, like ceramics. And this is one example from Kislovodsk in the Caucasus region of southern Russia, where there is so much ceramic material in these terraces you can see on the screen when they're excavated that the excavators are reasonably confident that the terraces and the ceramics originated around the same time. But this is very unusual, and ordinarily we have very small amounts of material in agricultural soils, and usually they're highly abraded and very difficult to identify. So hoping to find ceramics is not a reliable method, and especially because those ceramics are often redeposited. So they're often in mixed deposits which are redeposited, and we cannot tell that from looking at a conventional archaeological section through feature. So in terms of laboratory methods, that various methods have been applied, including radiocarbon dating of terrace sediments, which introduces a different level of accuracy, but also introduces a series of new problems alongside some existing problems. So the existing problems are, if the sediments have been redeposited or disturbed significantly, we can't necessarily tell before we get a date from a radiocarbon sample. And another sample identified recently by Ferry-Bathkis and her colleagues is that bulk samples tend to produce overestimates of the age. So radiocarbon from bulk samples of soil produces overestimates because of the existing carbon that is present in the environment from earlier periods. So it's a difficult method to apply and not necessarily very reliable, as well as being relatively expensive. Optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, is another method that has been used quite extensively, especially in the southern Levant, in Jordan, Palestine, Israel. This method is the one which I'm going to, a development of this method is the one which I'm going to talk about this morning. But the conventional approach, where individual samples are taken from terrace sediments and dated, suffers from similar problems to radiocarbon dating or artifact dating. That's to say, it's very hard to know whether this particular sample that we've taken from a terrace profile is what the history of its deposition is. So it's difficult to know whether that sediment is material that's been deposited from somewhere else, or whether it's grown up in situ, or what the history of the deposition is there. So we can't see easily if there's mixing or residuality in the deposits, for example. So the context is then hard to understand. So there've been a series of problems, and these have really hindered archaeologists in their attempt to understand these very, very common landscape features which exist not only all across the Mediterranean, but all across the world, on all continents except, I think, Australia. There are terraces which are part of UNESCO World Heritage Sites, for example. So it's quite an important question, an important problem. Not least when we're thinking about Byzantium. Well, a solution to this issue presented itself in the form of my colleague Tim Kinnaird, who you can see in his canoe in Greenland, bottom right. This was in one of his previous jobs when he worked as a geologist surveying in the Arctic. And Tim, I first met in 2011 when he was working at the Symposiarchs lab in Glasgow. And we were discussing the problem of dating terrace sediments, and he introduced the possibility of a solution using this instrument that you can see bottom left. This is Symposiarchs' portable OSL reader, which is a small instrument that you take into the field and which allows you to assess in situ, in the field, the luminescence behavior of the deposits that you're looking at in the field. The significance of this is that it allows you to get a first view of the full profile of the sediments that you're examining in the field. And that enables us to target much more effectively parts of the profile that might be valuable, useful for OSL dating subsequently in the lab. So by using the field instrument, the portable OSL instrument, we're able to assess in the field and check where we might want to put samples for dating, and indeed to check the behavior of the sediments. Because by assessing the profile in the field and subsequently also assessing the profile in the lab, we can look at the behavior of the sediments. And by examining things such as the intensity of the signal, the sensitivity of the sediments to natural radiation, and the apparent dose, that's the apparent environmental dose of radiation which has been collected by the sample, we can characterize whether those deposits have been redeposited or whether they've grown up in situ, something about the history of the terrace itself, the terrace sediment itself. And this is because the way that OSL dating works is you can think of it almost as the opposite of radiocarbon dating. So in radiocarbon dating, we measure the predictable decay of the sample. In OSL dating, we know that certain minerals trap naturally occurring radiation at a predictable rate, and we can measure that. And if we can measure the natural environmental dose rate of radiation, we can calculate the time when that sample started to build up its stored radiation dose. These samples release all of their dose when they're exposed to light or to heat. And so if we can calculate how much dose is accumulated, we can calculate when they were last exposed to light and therefore when they were buried. And that means we can work out the age of the deposits we're looking at. And using the portable instrument allows us to look at the deposition of the entire profile rather than just an individual point on the profile. And that's really useful for us because it gives us for the first time the ability to understand with much more accuracy the dating and the character of the sediments we're looking at in terrace soils and all kinds of archaeological earthworks actually. And so we've developed a solution in 5 steps so far. Firstly, we'll undertake initial surveys, identify sites, ground truth them, and then in a second stage we'll go into the field and sample the sites that we've identified, and we will profile in the field the sediments from those deposits. Then we'll take them to the lab and test them again, a series of further tests to make sure that we're going to be dating deposits which are going to yield useful information. Then in the 4th step, we subject them to formal OSL dating protocols, and that will give us the dates from the profile, and we can calibrate the whole profile sequence that we've got using those dates. And then we can relate that back to the broader landscape and to the landscape archaeology. So in order to test this solution, to test these 5 steps, we've been working in a series of case studies across the Mediterranean. 5 case studies so far. I'm going to talk about briefly, I'm going to talk about the 3 in the Eastern Mediterranean, which are most of interest to this conference. We'll start furthest east here in the Göksu Valley, where we've been working in partnership with the Bozak Archaeology Project. And this is an example of the landscape there. This is one of the first sites we're working at. That's my colleague Mark Jackson, who's gazing across the landscape at Agijerim Kuyusu here. And you can see this landscape, still an agricultural landscape, in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, with a large extent of terraces, some abandoned and some still cultivated. Well, these diagrams shows the locations that we sampled here in this area. Mark was standing just about here in the picture that you saw a moment ago. And here we produced some interesting results showing that these check dam terrace systems and these narrow valley bottoms were built over a long period of time. And this is more or less representative of what we thought the results would likely be. So we've got a terrace first constructed in the 5th century, then in the later Middle Ages, right up until the middle of the 19th century, the latest of those terraces was constructed. But the more work we did on this, using this technique, the more we realized that there were patterns in the data that we were seeing, and that in certain periods, terraces seem to have been constructed much more than in other periods. So this is another case study in the Bozak area. This is Gölcük, which is closer to the sea and the island of Bozak, ancient Asteria. You can see these terraces quite decayed now, in places still actually cultivated, but not very well maintained. So not very promising, apparently, for archaeological studies, but we persisted nonetheless, sampled 6 terraces in this area. And here we were particularly interested in the site because the black area in the center shows an extensive and with extensive standing remains, a late antique settlement. So we imagined that terraces here might belong to late antiquity. But in fact, what we found here was that the terraces dated to the later Middle Ages, probably constructed in the 12th or the 13th century in the case of this example. And the profiling data, where we used the portable instrument to calibrate dates all down the profile, showed that this was indeed quite correct. So a dating sample went in around here, around 70 centimeters depth, giving us a date of construction in the 12th century. And this allowed us to calibrate the profiling samples, showing that the terraces were used right through the Middle Ages and right into the 19th century. And that indeed the terraces here were almost certainly first constructed in the 12th century. And that's broadly the case for that case study. A second case study in Turkey at Urla Çeşme, working with Elif Koparal and her colleagues on the Urla Peninsula, Çeşme Peninsula here. We undertook dating of terraces in three separate locations. And you can see some of the examples of these terraces, some in trees, some in field systems, some beautifully constructed with stone staircases leading up between the terraces. And here, again, we were expecting the terraces might belong to the classical period or the Hellenistic period. But the dates once again showed that we have terrace construction from around about the beginning of the 2nd millennium up until the 18th century. A series of dates from those terrace systems consistently in that later period. And finally, we'll move back to Naxos, where we started, where we've been working on the Apaliru Environs project with Jim Crow and our colleagues from Oslo and the Greek Ministry of Culture. And I've been privileged to be involved in this project since 2014, 2015. And you can see the extent of the study area here. Now, here we know that this is a rich terrace landscape from our various studies, and we can see the terraces there, and here's our team undertaking field survey, but we don't know how old these terrace systems were. And the results of our field survey show that in several areas of the study area, there are dense artifact scatters, particularly on the mountain of Apaliru, with settlements dated from the artifacts to the 7th to 10th centuries of the 1st millennium AD. So really quite fascinating, quite an interesting site where Jim has been undertaking extensive survey. This is one of the preliminary surveys on the mountainside below the fortified settlement surveyed by our colleagues from Oslo on the mountain top. So here we expected that the terraces, again, would likely date to the early Byzantine period. And so we used this method to test a series of terraces all the way down the valley, immediately adjacent to this 7th to 10th century settlement, and the terraces on the mountainside around it. And the results from that were quite surprising to us, because once again, they showed that the terrace construction lay in the 2nd millennium AD, especially in the 12th and 13th centuries, and again in the 15th and 16th centuries. So in summary, our results so far, we have undertaken, we've collected, 52 profiles comprising over 500 field profiling samples and 350 lab profiling samples. And we have processed 65 OSL dates from these 5 case studies. So the 3 in the Eastern Mediterranean and 2 in Spain. And this summarizes those results. You can see that, that there's a distinct concentration of construction activity at the beginning of the 2nd millennium AD, so in the later Middle Ages, effectively. Across all of those case study areas, we can see that there are terraces constructed at other times, but that the peak in activity seems to be in this later medieval period, and you can see that represented in this diagram here, in the top diagram here. This is showing the sediment ages from the OSL profiling and dating campaigns for the construction, and the peaks of construction are in the beginning of the 2nd millennium AD. We've got continuous use throughout that period, going through into recent centuries, and that's because terraces seem to be continuously used in many areas right up to at least to the 19th century, even if they're not still in use today. So significant construction of terrace systems in the pilot study areas during that period, and evidence from the OSL profiles for continuous use with episodes of refurbishment. These are our preliminary results. If you find this interesting, you should be able to see the publication in the latest issue, or the next issue rather, of Antiquity. Very briefly, what this technique gives us is the ability to date accurately the use of terraces. By combining that with other soil science approaches, we should be able to write landscape history directly from the soil, directly from the sediment, by combining with geoarchaeology or pollen analysis or phytolith analysis and other techniques. And so we're currently engaged in a new research project called Terrace Age, with case studies, core case studies in Spain and Croatia, but also in Greece, and additional case studies in Turkey, in the Levant, and in Oman, as of about 2 weeks ago, which we hope will enable us to really contribute to this issue of understanding the development of the sediments of the terraces in much detail, and look forward to contributing towards things, aims like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, by understanding how these rural agricultural features enabled farmers in the past to respond resiliently to the challenges of changing climates and so on, and how they might be used in the future to provide the same kind of useful applications of low impact rural agriculture. So that's the end of my talk. Thanks very much to our collaborators and funders, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay,